This is Sorrel Hillman, and we are about to launch the fifth in a series of 10 informal discussions with one of America's most distinguished men of letters, John Mason Brown, on the general subject of the humanities. During this talk, we will be dealing with the question of style, specifically literary style. Mr. Brown, what distinguishes one writer from another, for example? Or to what extent can literary style be compared with styles in art, architecture, or music? Here is an excerpt from a famous short story. I am sure that nobody will question what this is or how at once it identifies the style of the man who wrote it. Quote, "Begin with an individual, and before you know it, you find that you have created a type. Begin with a type, and you find that you have created nothing." You know who wrote that, don't you, Mr.
I haven't
Brown?
the vaguest
No?
notion.
One of my favorite short stories, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Rich Boy.
I look forward to reading it at some time, and I don't think that it is a particularly individual sentence at all. I could challenge you on that by turning to other quotes and quizzes and give you one, and I wonder if you can spot styles.
You're not going to
and
persecute
periods.
me, are you?
No, I won't persecute. This is not a rigged quiz show. This is a conversation. All happy families resemble one another. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
I think that's Anna Karenina.
You're entirely right, and that is why I didn't coo when you quoted F. Scott Fitzgerald, because Fitzgerald was obviously basing his style upon this famous lead to Anna Karenina. It's been done again and again by novelists. Stark Young did it once, for example, employing this as the model style for the generality that leads to the particular. I didn't mean to be dismissive of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and certainly about you. I am a vast admirer of F. Scott Fitzgerald, though I happen to have drawn a total blank of darkness on this particular short story.
Let's get back now to some sort of definition of what style is. Can you pin that down?
Well, at the present time, there are a great many writers who desire not to have a style, at least an individual style, and they are enormously successful in not having a style and getting along, sometimes, without one. I shall not name names.
Do name some of them.
Oh,
James
it's
T.
not-
Farrell, for example?
No, because beyond the prose there comes the sweat of Farrell and the conviction of Farrell. His conviction is his style. But let me go back to what's much more important than a list of damnation. I personally believe that style is managing to say, in a way which is unmistakably your own, the thing that you want to say. It's saying accurately, in terms of words that you are fond of, what is the truth of your own personality or mind or spirit. It is the writer's voice, therefore it is his, and when it's a good style, or even a bad style, it's his and his alone, when he has achieved this marked individuality in print.
Somerset Maugham someplace wrote that good writing should be like a well-dressed man's clothes. They should be there, but unobtrusive.
Well, that's
Now-
a fascinating definition of a well-dressed man. Adam was well-dressed after the fall from the point of view of the standards of those days, but I suppose obtrusively dressed. Let's come back to what is the style, the voice in writing. A single writer can have several styles within himself. May I give you an illustration of this? One of the writers for whom I have the greatest fondness happens to be Charles Lamb, known to people who love his essays and his letters throughout the world usually as Elia. But Elia and Lamb write as very different people, at least to my way of thinking. When Charles Lamb is writing a letter to a friend from the agony of his heart or the humor of the day, then he writes a perfectly familiar contemporary style, at least of his own contemporaries. Then he is Charles Lamb. But when he begins to write a formal essay, he goes into costume and becomes Elia. And that is when he, in his famous sentence, said, "Hang the age, I'll write for posterity." He loved the past and retreated into it in what was his public prose, which was quite different from his private prose.
Well, of course, that's true of almost anybody, isn't it? That could be argued of any public man, of a Franklin Roosevelt, who in his public papers wrote and spoke very differently from the way he did in private life, or Churchill or anybody else.
I would disagree in the case of Mr. Churchill. Mr. Churchill certainly is one of the great masters. He has several styles, but he's one of the great masters of style. I remember that on one of Churchill's visits to this country, one of his daughters was asked, "Does your father always talk this way?" And the daughter paused and said, "Yes, to the best of my recollection, since I was a child, I've never heard my father say a sentence which couldn't have been written down and sounded exactly as if he were addressing the House of Commons."
Even when he nicked himself shaving.
Well, she wasn't in the room. It was an English household. May I give you an illustration of where the personal style also is the public style? I mentioned Churchill as having one style, well, at least one sonority, one overtone, one resonance that is Churchillian, and we all know it's Churchillian. But I would say that George Bernard Shaw couldn't write a letter without writing it as well and as brilliantly, and tossing the sentences as superbly and athletically into the air as if he were writing a preface or a speech for a play. I've never read a poor letter by Shaw, or a letter that couldn't have been published as written, though it wasn't originally meant for publication.
I doubt that Shaw wrote many letters that weren't ultimately intended for publication.
No, I think Shaw wrote many letters which have already begun to be published. There will be a whole library of Shaw, of incidental letters that will be eventually collected, and they'll be infinitely more sprightly reading than the Boswell letters of papers.
Wouldn't you say that Shaw's style on the whole is pretty much the same, which is not said in disparagement?
No, Shaw despised the word style as we are discussing it. He happened to despise it because he had it, and he didn't have to bother about it. Mrs. Patrick Campbell once said that Shaw, being an Irishman, had an Irish thrush in his throat and sang naturally, which is true up to a point. And I don't mean to say anything against the Irish, but not all of them sing like Shaw. Only elements of style that mattered, said Shaw. The alpha and omega of style is emphasis. And certainly he was emphatic and deliberately over-emphatic in stating his ideas. He also realized the value of cadence. You mentioned earlier the other arts. Shaw, if you recall, was one of the people, and there have been several, and this should frighten educators, who deliberately avoided what he called the menace or entrapment of education. And instead of being threatened by education, Shaw taught himself. He said, my university was the National Museum in Dublin. My teacher of English, my greatest one, was Mozart. And he said, not until I had mastered the full cadences and glories of Don Giovanni could I ever have pretended to master the intricacies and glories and cadences of an English sentence.
He always claimed he learned more about English from music.
Yes, and fine as his ear was, Mozart was the true analogy, because there you have all the sparkle as well as the deep chords underneath.
What would you think of this sentence from Logan Pearsall Smith's Trivia? You must beware of thinking too much about style, or you will become like those fastidious people who polish and polish until there is nothing left.
I should think that would be absolutely true. The danger of too much style would be to make you muscle-bound. It's the danger faced, say, by ballerinas who, if they dance too long and train too hard, develop legs which are monstrosities. They would be all right for the arms of Lionel Strongford, but they are not pretty extremities for a dying swan. In other words, they are overdeveloped by overtraining. And I think if you have only style, then you usually have nothing to say, because you are the victim of self-consciousness.
Aren't there a good many English writers of the late 19th century of whom that could be said? Pater, for example?
I'm glad you mentioned Pater. When I was young, and this is how the fashion in styles changes, Pater was taught to all of us as the model writer of that particular period. I find it almost impossible to read a sentence by Pater. It is so lacquered, so twisted, so serpentine, and so involuted that to me it creates a barrier between what is the sense of the sentence, and there is great sense, and what is the expression of the sentence. The words form a dead end to the idea. Let's go back to what everybody has been brought up on, and that is the three Greek orders, the Doric, the Ionic, and then the Corinthian. And that is a growth in involution and complexity. The most beautiful, to my way of thinking still, is the Doric with its utter simplicity. And then you have the appendages added, the circle horns stuck under the crown above the supporting ring. And then, of course, you come into the Ionic. But when you get to the Corinthian with the Ianthus leaves, then you are coming into what is almost the Roman excess as opposed to the Greek purity, the first purity and simplicity. May I move from those three orders, because those orders could be found in the English language, to a famous sentence by William Hazlitt. Now, Hazlitt is a stylist whom I think you would approve of right now, as opposed, say, to Lamb.
I know that Maugham, who has written a great deal about style in that wonderful book, The Summing Up, concludes by saying that of all the people he would like to have modeled himself after, Hazlitt was the one.
And I think where Maugham and Hazlitt have a great deal in common, and where Shaw would have a great deal in common with both of them, and all good writers, including Mr. Hemingway, is that Hazlitt hated what he called the occult style. And the occult style is what Pater came to have in a later period. And Hazlitt wanted, as I tried to indicate before, the voice of a man to make itself heard in print. I hate anything, he said, that occupies more space than it is worth. I hate to see a load of bandboxes go along the street, and I hate to see a parcel of big words without any meaning in them. In other words, He was reaching for what is one of the controversial elements in style and the discussion of writing, and that is, how long should a sentence be? You may have read, Mr. Hillman, a few years ago a book asking sentences to range from 17 to 25 words in length. The man who was writing the book was asking for clarity and directness. That's what he was asking for. It seemed to me, however, he pushed his point too far, because the whole point of a sentence is it is as long as it seems.
Or as long as it has to be.
As long as you can keep it off the ground. Now, Shaw can write sentences that are extremely long, but his ear is such, and lung power, even in print, is such, that the voice is kept raised. He never drops his voice. The diaphragm is there in the inkwell, pumping the whole time. And you can get short sentences that are so deadly, you can't read them.
I think there is the great distinction between simplicity and clarity. Simplicity, when it's overdone, is totally arid, isn't it? And also can have the effect of making the point unclear.
I'm trying to reflect upon your Confucius words about Confucius, I said, not confusing, about simplicity being merely...
Well, simplicity, as distinct from clarity, if the sentence is reduced way, way, way down for the effect of making it simple, easy to read, and clear, sometimes it can have exactly the opposite effect, leaving out basic things that needed to be put in.
Well, let me turn to the man who suffers from too much certainty. Let me take one of the greatest stylists of all times, a man now, I think, not properly appreciated because he was condemned by his own surety. He is the victim of his dogmatism. I'm speaking of Thomas Babington Macaulay, and this is typical Macaulay. This is his famous essay on Boswell's Life of Johnson. And listen to the shortness of the sentence, the conviction of the mind, and the clarity of the phrasing, indeed the overconfidence of the judgment. This is Boswell. That such a man should have written one of the best books in the world is strange enough. But this is not all. Many persons who have conducted themselves foolishly in active life and whose conversation has indicated no superior powers of mind have left us valuable works. And then he goes into a long catalogue of writers. La Fontaine was in society a mere simpleton, his blunders, etc., etc. And in other words, how is it possible that the world's biggest fool should have written the world's greatest biography? This is the question that he raises.
Which, of course, modern research has disputed. He no longer looks like the greatest fool.
Having followed the Boswell papers, I will say that he's one of the most gifted fools. I cannot say that he was a total fool. I'm certain you remember the famous paragraph that we were all exposed to in our childhoods at school. I still love to go back to it for just sheer vividness. Now remember how long ago this was written, and yet how contemporary it is in its simplicity. Johnson grown old. Johnson in the fullness of his fame and in the enjoyment of a competent fortune is better known to us than any other man in history. Everything about him, his coat, his wig, his figure, his face, his scrofula, his St. Vitus's dance, his rolling walk, his blinking eye, the outward signs which too clearly marked his approbation of his dinner, his insatiable appetite for fish sauce and veal pie with plums, his inextinguishable thirst for tea, his trick of touching the posts as he walked, his mysterious practice of treasuring up scraps of orange peel, his morning slumbers, his midnight disputations, and so forth and so forth. This isn't the end of it by a long shot.
It's wonderful rolling stuff, isn't it?
It is almost Dr. Johnson rolling down the street, touching the posts as he goes, because every detail is clicked off gloriously.
And every word is just right.
Another illustration, which you will be relieved to know I do not have with me, but this goes back to William Hazlitt. Hazlitt, who was the master of the short sentence, when he wanted to be, could also be the master of the sustained sentence. In a famous paragraph, Hazlitt once took the inventory of Coleridge's mind. He and Coleridge were off and on friends. All friends of Hazlitt were only occasional friends because he had a gift of the resistance for friendship, which amounted to part of his genius. Anyway, taking the catalog or the inventory of Coleridge's mind, knowing how confused Coleridge was, how many great thoughts lived side by side, how much like an attic the mind was, an overstuffed attic, he did a sentence deliberately that is 2.5 pages long. And it's a reeling sentence, but yet it is kept somehow, as I say, by this sound, diaphragm, lightness, and rightness. It's kept so that you are not aware of its length. You are only aware of a man over-endowed and confused by his over-endowment. And you realize that what Hazlitt is doing in that sentence is justifying a point he may even make in that paragraph or that sentence. He described Coleridge at one point as having a full and sensuous mouth, magnificent eyes, a glorious forehead, and too small a nose for his face. And the question was, why too small a nose? And Hazlitt's answer was, because the nose, of course, is rudder to the soul. And the fact that he didn't have any rudder is why he meandered so, and why Hazlitt meandered in describing the contents of Coleridge's brilliant mind.
At least he had enough of a rudder to do the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner.
He did.
I was very interested in what you said earlier about the almost deliberate lack of style that some of the contemporary writers have. And our mention of Maugham reminds me that Maugham has written a great deal about having consciously tried to develop a style by going to the British Museum and solemnly copying down sentence after sentence of writers he admired, like Jeremy Taylor, and then committing them to memory, and moving from one writer to another to try to work out a style for himself until he finally realized that that wasn't the kind of writer he was. But who does that today?
Well,
or should it be done?
The most famous example, much more famous really than Maugham, is Robert Louis Stevenson. And the famous phrase is when he described himself as a young man functioning as a, quote, a sedulous ape. And what he did was to copy, day after day, in their entirety, the essays from the Tatler and the Spectator, or the writers that he admired. But then, of course, and I'm answering the second part of your question, if you read the magazines published by secondary schools, or high schools, or even colleges in this country, or many first novels, you can almost tell which older author the younger author has admired, because there's bound to be a rub-off of admiration. But the moment a man achieves style, in the sense of his own style, is when he has ceased to be an ape and become himself. He has stood up. He's no longer a copyist. He is somebody that people copy.
I'm glad you mentioned Stevenson, because I think he's another very good example of the writer who wrote what once in one period was enormously admired as a gifted, smooth, mellifluous style, and today wouldn't be so considered by most people. Don't you think so?
I would disagree. If that is the common verdict, I would, in Mr. Goldman's phrase, include me out, because Robert Louis Stevenson, in the essays, may be too-mannered, though there are fine phrases all the way through. In the letters are extraordinarily able, and in the moments of indignation, such as the famous letter about Father Damien and the leper colony, then the indignation takes away what is the acanthus leaf and the fanciness. But let's get to the novels. I still know of no narrative style for the telling of an adventure story as glorious as the one in Treasure Island or in Kidnapped. I don't think you can find a better style for that kind of writing. The trouble with Stevenson's style from the point of view of older people, trained on Joyce or Jung or Freud or any of the psychological novelists, James or Proust, is that Stevenson had a great gift of narrative and a only fair gift of character. These characters are apt to sweep through industry, darkness, black eyes, humpbacks, pirates, apples stolen, hiding in barrels, but without any inward life. That was very fair, as in the case of the Master of Balance.
Yes, no firm sense of the beginning, middle, and end either. I mean, a real tight plot sense.
Well, the reason that Stevenson often failed to sustain a novel was because so frequently his health, as in the case of Treasure Island, gave out halfway through with his consumption. He had a terrible siege of hemorrhaging and had to put the story aside. And then, if you remember Treasure Island, that's when that break comes. And the story is going superbly on a main course, and then comes the doctor's narrative.
Yes, the abrupt transition.
And then it picks up again and becomes admirable towards the end. But I grant he couldn't sustain.
Do you have any more first or last sentences from novel stories that would help point up the difference in style between...
Yes, I have so, but before we come to those, I'd like, if I may, to come back to the architectural image that you raised, the parallel. Let me go first to one of the supreme stylists of our time, and I'm speaking of Mr. Ernest Hemingway. And Ernest Hemingway once wrote these memorable lines about writing. Prose, said he, is architecture, not interior decoration, and the Baroque is past. People in a novel, not skillfully constructed characters, must be projected from the writer's assimilated experience and from his knowledge, from his head, and from his heart, and from all that there is of him. If he ever has luck, as well as seriousness, and gets them out entire, they will have more than one dimension, and they will last a long time. And this is the paragraph that I really think is admirable. There are some things which cannot be learned quickly, and time, which is all we have, must be paid heavily for their acquiring. They are the very simplest things, and because it takes a man's life to know them, the little new that each man gets from life is very costly, and the only heritage he has to leave. And the little new that each man gets from life, being the only heritage that he has to leave, plus the struggle to learn the individual facts and state it simply, has been Mr. Hemingway's contribution. If you would turn to A Farewell to Arms, you'll find, I think, how happily Mr. Hemingway has been influenced by Miss Gertrude Stein. You know, Miss Stein was one of the great teachers of English in our time.
You really seriously mean that?
Yes. I'm not talking about our own style. I'm talking about two of the people, young writers, who were admirers.
Hemingway certainly admired her.
Hemingway and Thornton Wilder, both of whom were profoundly influenced by her. There was a time when people were taught in English courses, still may be true, that in one paragraph you must never repeat a word. Find, if you can, a synonym, anything, but don't say that word again. Gertrude Stein realized the value of almost the Chinese torture drippage of words, the melodic effect or the sound effect. And she, without making too much sense in the employment of this technique, wrote, and by her writing influenced Hemingway. In A Farewell to Arms, in those famous first pages, as I recall, when he is describing the Italian retreat, Hemingway uses the word green.
Green?
Green, the adjective. He uses it again and again and again. He does it deliberately, exactly as a painter would create a dominant color in a canvas. And this is when you get to word painting, where you have almost an equivalent technique to what is actual painting, oil painting. Style, in this sense, becomes a pen stroke, which is as deliberate as the brush stroke and as individual as the brush stroke of a painter. Hemingway has always had the courage of his repetitions.
I'd just like to say one more thing about Hemingway. I think, of course, that last page of Farewell to Arms, which Hemingway once said that he rewrote something like 50 times, is superb, clear writing, each word is right in its place, and there you get the enormously conscious, deliberate stylist, just as in the case of Colette, who could spend an entire day working on a single sentence, or Flaubert, who'd spend a week working on a word. But in Hemingway's case, that what started out as superb clarity, and of course was, as you say, influenced by Stein, has on occasion ended up as clarity corrupted into simplicity, what we were talking about earlier. I think in the case of The Old Man and the Sea, that's true.
I happen to admire The Old Man and the Sea greatly. I have absolutely no admiration for Across the River and Into the Trees. But for Hemingway as a whole, I have an enormous admiration. I know one thing about Hemingway, that his ear for speech, supposedly so dictaphonic, is not nearly as dictaphonic as it gives the illusion of being. I have seen translations from the novel, say, A Farewell to Arms, to the stage, in which the actual dialogue was just pasted into place. And what the eye could take in, the ear rejected as a true recording of daily speech.
I remember that an English professor I had at Harvard used to read Hemingway's stories aloud to illustrate to the students the fact that this isn't really a literal dialogue at all. And the same thing could be said of John O'Hara, whose dialogue is considered so superbly realistic. It is realistic, but it isn't literal speech.
You're coming to an awfully interesting point in style and the reproduction of daily speech, in other words, of dialogue. Let me go back to Hemingway for a moment, and I think you may agree with me in this, that one of the strange qualities or characteristics of Hemingway's dialogue is that in almost all of the novels, the dialogue sounds like a translation. You have the sense not of so much English as something that has been taken over from another language. You have the sense of the removal from the daily. It's a mannered rhythm to begin with. But I think the descriptive passage are admirable. I mentioned the descriptive passage, but let me turn to a famous one, which we in our youth, I don't know whether you did because you are younger, but I used to read this and think it was fun. I think you'll identify it. In that pleasant district of merry England, which is watered by the river Don, there extended in ancient times a large forest, covering the greater part of the beautiful hills and valleys which lie between Sheffield and the pleasant town of Doncaster, and so forth.
Sounds dull enough to be Walter Scott.
It is dull enough to be Walter Scott. In fact, it is Walter Scott. And may I say, this is what is upsetting. It isn't because Scott was dull. He's dull to us.
Dull to us today.
To those who were reading the Waverley novels. No one gives that much description. No one postpones action for as many pages as that. No person today would ever think of taking a shovelful of expository material and just hurling it at the reader without any dramatization or novelization. But if you turn to another thing of Scott's in prose, and of course there are fine passages once you get past the barrier in all of the Scott novels, and wonderful characters with true depth. But if you turn to one of my favorite things in Scott, I believe it's about 50 or 55 pages, his autobiographical introduction to Lockhart's Life of Scott. Scott had started to write his autobiography died, and then his son-in-law, Lockhart, picked up and finished the book. Lockhart's book is admirable according to the conventions of biography at its time. But Scott's prose in the introduction has the kind of dancing vitality and brevity that we expect of Shaw. It's one of the most surprising reversals of style as opposed to what was this mannered style in the novel that I've just quoted from Ivanhoe. You said, why did I say, and why didn't I name the novelists who seem to have no style or rejoice in having none?
Rejoice most particularly in having none.
Well, that would be the most flattering comment on their work. I happen to read and have to read for the book of the month novel after novel after novel. They're all 1,500 pages long, and not one of these novelists, alas, has ever heard of Margaret Sanger. There is no word control in the whole flow of language. They go on and on endlessly. Now, the pity is that what Hemingway did, as you described, in A Farewell to Arms, that drastic, that Spartan self-discipline in rewriting, that pruning, is what half of these writers, alas, will not do. They have poor ears to begin with. They have no individual voices to follow up with. And secondly, they haven't got enough conscience to work again. They take it as a first statement rather than the final statement.
Perhaps they have nothing to say.
Some of them have something to say, but say it at too great length, and say it without any individual possession of the subject. You will admit in the case of the great novelists, for example, such as Dickens or Thackeray or Scott, whatever the period conventions, or you turn to Hemingway or Thomas Wolfe, any of these men, Proust, we instantly can sense who is writing. There's no question who's talking because the man has possessed the material. Now, these people have taken no possession, and furthermore, this is a phrase I keep using again and again at the Book of the Month Club meetings, if they would only put it through the ringer one more time, just wash it once more, because some of them are so near to being right. Publishers say that you cannot persuade half these writers to cut a word. 10 years later, they would probably give their eye teeth to cut many words if they ever dare to reread what they've written in such haste and with such love. But the editorial sense doesn't go with the creative sense for them, and it's a pity. This is why Mr. Fadiman has described so many of the younger writers as belonging not to the beat generation or the angry young men, but the unedited generation, because they have no gift for editing themselves so that what should be a personal style comes through.
On the other hand, you can find an author like J.P. Marquand who has a very sharp individualistic style, and yet I personally think that in many of his novels, he too goes on too long. You can have an individual style which hasn't enough restraint in it.
I mean this with no sense of sacrilege, but I can scarcely think of the book or play in the world, including the Bible, that isn't longer than it needs to be, that couldn't benefit by some judicious cutting. I get the idea of the begat and begot chapter, for example, rather early.
The repetitiveness of it got through to you.
It did. I began to understand we were moving down the generations rather rapidly and in the same way. It became a catalog to me as a continuity. You can't read it for pleasure. You may read it for information.
Glad you brought up the Bible because, again, to quote Mr. Maughan, I don't know whether you'd agree with this or not, he argues someplace that the Bible had a harmful effect on English prose in that so many otherwise extremely good writers tried to model their prose on the Bible, and that they brought in Oriental imagery, which really had no place in it at all.
Well, Miss Edith Hamilton, in The Greek Way, has made a comment more or less of the same kind about the influence of the Bible on the rhythms of English poetry as well as English prose. Miss Hamilton was endeavoring to compare what is the starkness, the absolute streamlined quality, the undecorated quality of Greek writing, the Doric line of Greek writing, with what is the highly decorated line of the Bible. And she put it in terms of what was a kind of Mediterranean Oriental imagery. It was with all of the curlicues rather than the simplicity. A poem, for example, that she cannot stand is opening casements on fairylands, magic casements on fairylands forlorn. And Miss Hamilton says the Greeks would never have said it that way. In the first place, says she, you can't have a fairyland that's forlorn. That isn't the point of the fairyland. And you wouldn't open a casement on it if it were forlorn. But she is arguing for the simplicity. I know, as you know, that the Bible must have been meant to be absorbed through the ear. Hence, it seems to me, the glory and justification of its repetitions. They are patterns of speech. It's almost like choral music, so many of the chapters. And I think that one of the rich qualities in our English diet, when properly pruned, comes from what is the glory of the Old and New Testaments. Certainly you can find no more glorious writing any place in the world than in both Testaments, in spite of Mr. Maughan.
Well, we certainly agree that styles change as generations and trends change. I came across something amusing the other day, which helps to point up the corruption of Madison Avenue on the language today. This is a mock memo, and I'll just read 2 or 3 sentences from it. You will recall that we've been firming up this problem for some time, and just in the nature of pitching up a few mashy shots to see if we come near the green, I'd like to express these angles. And then 2 or 3 paragraphs later. In other words, we might get caught off first base, and the whole thing might go over like a lead balloon. So let me urge that we all kick this around and put on our creative thinking cap so that all of us will profit in the final wrap-up.
Well, I can find nothing to say in favor of it and everything against, but it seems to me to say everything against itself so that any other comment is totally unnecessary. I want to go back to the establishment of the mood in a book by the first sentence, and also in a play. I think in the few examples we have cited from novels that you get the idea of the first paragraph that quickly says what is the scene and gives you some sense of what is to come. This is one I wonder if you would in any way place. I'm not trying to give you a quiz, but in fact, being of a generous nature and having just reveled in the Bible.
Oh, don't tell me.
All right, I won't tell you. I'll revert to that other character, Beelzebub. This is the first sentence. As the manager of the performance sits before the curtain on the boards and looks into the fair, a feeling of profound melancholy comes over him in his survey of the bustling place.
I'm ashamed to say I have any idea what that is.
Well, I wouldn't have known either if I hadn't looked it up. The only giveaway word there would be fair. It's Vanity Fair. And of course, Thackeray did, if you remember, go through the whole book as a stage manager of a fair. And if this is a good first sentence, and I don't think it is, by modern standards...
It's leaden, but it's a good lead in newspaper parlance because it establishes the who, what, and where, and why.
Yeah, but it has a kind of lead balloon, if I can go back to Madison Avenue for a moment, quality. You can do it much better sometimes in plays. This one, I think you would guess, anybody in the world would get these, who's there? Nay, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself. Long live the king. Bernardo? No. You come most carefully upon your hour. Well, we all know that. It has to be one thing. It can't be anything else. It is, of course, Hamlet. But you're raising a question there of style that is, to me, fascinating because of the comment that has been made on this particular scene and the scenes that follow it by T.S. Eliot, a most distinguished stylist and writer himself. In this scene appears the great line, the dawn in russet mantle came, and all these things, with the first cock crow and so forth in the watch, and the appearance of the king, not to Hamlet, but to the followers on the parapets. Eliot, in a famous essay written about 35 years ago, said words to this effect as his first line: we must confess that, considered by any standards, Hamlet is a failure. That was something of a first line. He then objected to the dawn in russet mantle came and so forth, saying that they were too fancy, that they were poetic phrases that held up a dramatic narrative. More recently, in an essay spoken at Harvard on poetry and the drama, he has reversed himself on this, saying that he thinks that these are fine because these very first words which I read are really night watchman words. They are patrol words. They are San Francisco beat words, or story words, in dragnet words, in terms of the beginnings of blank verse.
If all you want are the facts, they're there.
They're there. Yes, ma'am. But the point is that he says when you begin to get the dawn and russet mantle, etc., you get that first coloration of poetry, lifting what is melodrama off the ground, off the parapets in this case, and turning it into what is extraordinary verse.
It's exactly what Maxwell Anderson tries to do, isn't it? And doesn't always succeed in doing in his plays.
Mr. Anderson writes metrically, and sometimes his verse sings, and sometimes it doesn't. I don't think he has ever written better than in the fine speech of the old rabbi spoken in Winterset when the bodies of the 2 dead lovers are stretched before the rabbi. The speech that runs, on this star, in this hard star adventure, knowing not what the fires mean to right and left, nor whether a meaning was intended or presumed, man can stand up and look out blind and say, in all these turning lights I find no clue, only a masterless night, and in my blood no certain answer. Yet is my mind my own, yet is my heart a cry towards something dim in distance, which is higher than I am, and makes me emperor of the endless dark, even in the seeking.
Can you think of other contemporary plays which instantly establish the identity of the author or the style?
Well, now you are coming to a different standard, and this is why what we have talked about, that is older writing, has been rejected by new writing. But let me go to a line that you will, of course, know. The scene happens to be the press room in the Chicago Criminal Courts building, and I think anyone can guess that. And the card players are playing, and they're saying together, more or less, or above each other, "Crack it for a dime, buy me, I stay, me too. I'm behind again. I was even a couple of minutes ago. Perhaps 3, 2, 3 to the dealer." Well, you know.
Obviously the front page.
It is
And of
the
course
front
the
page.
last line, just as memorable, "The son of a bitch stole my watch."
It's one of the superb curtain
One of the
lines,
great
curtain
last lines of any...
Just exactly like, "Hey, wait for baby," in What Price Glory. I mention this line because this raises aesthetically an extremely interesting point. Robert Sherwood, who was a romantic at heart, when these plays, which he admired, he loved What Price Glory particularly, and he loved the front page. But Robert Sherwood said that the influence of plays as strong as this, in a realistic tradition, had been bad for what was the core of the theater. He said the trouble with so much dramatic literature and so much novel writing in the early 20s was that the muse of literature wore a green eye shade. In other words, it was taking literature out of the realm of literature and putting it into the realm of mere reporting and making it dictaphonic. Certainly you will admit that realism is one of the great influences of our time, and that most writing now is written in the image of realism. And the biggest lie told in aesthetics, the biggest lie of realism is to pretend to be real at all, when it can only hope to be the creation of the illusion of reality.
Again, Hemingway.
Again, almost every way at the present time. Mr. Sherwood's point was that there is a point at which journalism has to leave off and real writing begin. I come to the question of so-called realistic plays, you know, plays where the audience gasps because they turn on the stove and the burner works because there's a sterno underneath it. And everyone who wouldn't want to turn on a stove at home gasps with admiration just because a sterno flame comes on. And that's one form of realism. And
Velasco form.
the dialogue is very much like it. It's, "Hey, you," it's what can be said. It's not the heat, it's the humidity. It's every bromide that all of us happen to be guilty of in almost every sentence that we utter daily.
Tossed out on the theory that after all people do talk this way.
This is the way people talk. Now, the better writers, and certainly the important ones, whatever the medium for which they have been writing, it seems to me, have tried to write as people behave, but not necessarily as people talk. You will admit that no peasant girl in the history of the world ever talked as Shaw's Joan talks. That no Prince of Denmark ever, I'm saying nothing against Denmark, I'm all pro-UN, but no Prince of Denmark ever summoned the music from his lips that Hamlet can summon in speech after speech after speech. In each of those cases, what you have is the gift bestowed by the writer. And in the really fine writers, I think you are watching for the story as told, or dramatized, but you are hoping for that personal possession, the thing we've been talking about in the case of Marquand or Hemingway, or any of the people whose imprint, whether in verse or prose, has been strong enough to be unmistakable. And it's the unmistakable voice that seems to be the real stylist, in the final sense. We have mentioned style in literature, but we have not in any way turned to what does interest me, and that is professional touches of styles. Each profession seems to have its own style. You have mentioned Madison Avenue. That certainly has developed a jargon that is individual, unmistakable, and totally regrettable. But almost every profession does bear the imprints of the blinders of the profession. The writer happens to be free of that. His one desire is to communicate cleanly. Let me just turn to the legal profession for a moment. And we all at one time or another have to look at a legal document. And you know, Dickens quite rightly described legal language when he spoke of fog pouring up the river, fog pouring over the city, fog pouring into the courtroom.
Yes, Bleak House.
In Bleak House, yes. And most of us are apt to think of the law in those terms, in legal documents, because there are so many whereases and whereofs and wherefores and synonyms to cover every possibility. But lawyers, of course, can write beautifully when they are not held down by their legalisms and responsibilities. Take somebody, for example, such as Mr. Cardozo. Cardozo was one of the true stylists. He tried to, almost in terms of Sheridan writing about the forms of puffery in The Rivals, or Polonius describing comedy. Cardozo said that he had discerned 6 types or methods of writing in the law: the type magisterial or imperative, the type laconic or sententious, the type conversational or homely, the type refined or artificial, smelling of the lamp, verging at times upon preciosity or euphuism, the type demonstrative or persuasive, and finally, and this is the one I must admit Mr. Hillman I love, the type tonsorial or agglutinated, so-called from the shears and the paste pot.
Well, I think he's pretty well covered the field.
He hasn't really covered the field. He's covered the faults of the field, not coming to the right style. The fact that a man is a lawyer doesn't mean that he can't write superlatively. Mr. Abraham Lincoln is one proof
Was a
of
lawyer,
that.
yes.
Justice Holmes is another, Adlai Stevenson another, and the law as a background never hurt Robert Louis Stevenson. It's not hurt a good many people who have practiced it for the time. But there are legalisms which can weigh down the most felicitous style. Justice Frankfurter, for example, can be an admirable writer. And the sentences, as in his telling of the Sacco Vanzetti case, can move as swiftly and as clearly and as lightly as the best told reconstruction of a murder story. But sometimes in his decisions, addresses, you will find that he cannot escape from legalism, such as eschew, bifurcate, aliquot, eventuate, adumbrate, and effectuate. Those are words which I find very hard to take because they almost mute whatever music is in the sentence.
They're exhausting because they get you running up and down to the bookcase.
Well, but I mentioned those words and the law, the legalisms, because there are other jargons from other professions. If you will read music criticism, you can find that it is overloaded with technical terms from the point of view of the non-musical reader. The same thing is true of ballet criticism.
Less true of drama criticism, though, don't you think?
It's less true because there are less technical terms, at least in common employment. But let's turn to the Freudian or post-Freudian novel. I can tell almost instantly when a writer has been studying too much Freud or too much Jung or even too much law, because you will find those awful sentences, those heavy words, my golly, those words that really are just blockbusters, just tons of cement that fall in the middle of an otherwise admirable sentence. Instead of taking the simple word, they'll take the word that has 16 syllables, and then they feel that they must be learned because they have used the ugly, long, and indefensible word.
Well, that's a habit of failing that really goes on generation after generation, isn't it?
Well, I'm not merely speaking now of Latinisms in the sense that they cursed or distinguished Dr. Johnson. I'm now speaking of Freudianisms. In other words, the couch vocabulary has crept into the printer's rack, and it's too bad. As I say, when it ceases to be the language of a novelist and it's the borrowed language of a profession. I'm not talking about dialogue, I'm talking about the descriptive passages.
Well, doesn't style also consist of using the exact, precise word that should be used, that knowledge of when to use it and when not to?
You're now speaking of proper words,
Yes.
not improper. But style, in its best sense, by the best writers, has always been the search not for just a word, not any word. Too many writers, the ones who have no style, just use any word.
Or phrase?
Or phrase. Not for any word, and not even for the mot juste, which is just the just word.
Mm-hmm.
But the best writing is always the inevitable word. It's more than just or juste. It is inevitable. You say to yourself, how did that word ever come there? It is so right. There's no other word that can take its place.
Well, I came across a sentence that is absolutely, I think, perfect of its kind the other day in an old New Yorker, and the New Yorker certainly deserves to be mentioned. It's creating a very definite and special and individual style of its own. 2 or 3 words in this particular sentence strike my fancy. This is a profile that ran some 20 years ago by Elva Johnston, who was one of the very best of all of the magazine and newspaper writers, and it was a profile of a New York newspaper photographer, and he describes the fact that he was trying to take a picture of Andrew Carnegie. And there are just a couple of sentences here. Jackson's man, that is, the man who was helping him, pulled Carnegie from his car and shoved him against the wall of a building. The photographer let off a terrific explosion of flashlight. When the picture was developed, Carnegie's eyes were popping out, and his expression of terror showed that he thought he was being assassinated. The picture of the fear-stricken philanthropist was never used. For a similar picture today, a photographer would probably receive a bonus. Now, to me, the key phrase in there is fear-stricken philanthropist, which just sums up such a wonderfully vivid picture of Carnegie. Other writers might have said the picture of Carnegie was never used. I think that is style right there, don't you?
Absolutely, because there is, when you need the color, this is just as Mr. Hemingway uses, as I said, the adjective green. Here, that fear-stricken as an adjective conjures the image, and that is the point. The picture is there. You don't need the flash bulbs. Alva Johnson has created the photograph himself. And that, of course, is among the obligations of writing.
Well, of course, Hemingway also knew exactly when not to use an adjective. Almost as superbly as he did when to use it, didn't
Mr.
he?
Hillman, that is the whole other side, perhaps the bigger side of that coin. A coin can have a larger side. This is what I mean about the unedited generation. The people who use 5 adjectives where none are needed whatsoever. And the people who, and this is to go back to what was a source of Greek strength, the people who fail to realize that a verb correctly used can do the work of 100 adjectives.
Well, you remember the opening of Hemingway's classic story, The Killers. The door of Henry's lunchroom opened, and two men came in. They sat down at the counter.
There's no color there. That's deliberate.
Deliberately pruned and cut right
Cut.
down, and the whole atmosphere is laid out in front of you. And the
Well,
whole...
compare that to the beginning of Ivanhoe, and you see exactly what I mean. This is all excess. This is uncooked spinach, it seems to me, and this is really magnificent in its sparseness, because the image is all there, if the mind is quick enough to take it in.
Well, do you suppose that within a few years we'll get back to some sort of veneration for style, as style?
I haven't the vaguest notion. I can only say that if there is a future, and if the future in any way corresponds to the past, that you will always have a swinging of a pendulum between what is a classical preference and a romantic indulgence. The right forms of writing are apt to swing between the exuberances which are romantic and the controls which are classic, and that at least has always been the repeated pattern of the arts, all the arts, including writing. In the 19th century, there are many styles that we remember from those years that I wish the writers had never achieved. It would been better if they hadn't attempted.
True, but at least they were attempting to achieve a particular style as well as to say something.
You say to achieve the style. The famous line is, the style is the man. That is what we have all been brought up on, that adage. But it is more than the man, it does seem to me. It's the man and the artist in print. It's the man who knows what he's doing and why he does it. There has to be a vast amount of self-consciousness in the sense of deliberation, even in work that seems to lack all consciousness or effort. One of the troubles with contemporary writing, if I may say so from the point of view of style, if we talk about the absence of the present, is that a great many people do not bother to make copy readable. And making copy readable, making what is bound to be effortful seem easy, is one of the first obligations of writing. The writer should do the work, not the reader. And in too many contemporary books, because of lazy writing, the reader does the writer's work for him, and this is one of the things that I object to.
I think there was Matthew Arnold who once said, have something to say and say it as clearly as you can. That is the only secret of style.
Well,
Which isn't quite right, of course.
Well, it is what Shaw said, it is the alpha and omega conviction and so on. I think the men who have had something to say, as a rule, no, this isn't true. Take a man who did have something to say within our times, and that is Dreiser. And Dreiser was a man with true protest in his heart, a true sense of character and of scene. But the style is a very heavy, dead style, even today. It was to me, at least, when I read it as it came out. But it's grown heavier with time. Take somebody much further back, who it seems to me is one of the most appalling stylists in the world, and certainly was one of the most popular of all American authors, not only here but abroad. Take James Fenimore Cooper. It is almost impossible nowadays to persuade a child, to coerce, to bludgeon, to clobber a child into reading Cooper uncut.
You remember Twain's great essay on Cooper's literary offenses.
Oh, well, you mean with the barge going under the tree. That is one of the great parodies in American literature, one of the great creatively critical essays in our language. But turn to Twain. There you have a perfectly extraordinary style in the sense of its being contemporary, as of this moment contemporary, when you consider how long ago the stories were written. He was not cursed by that period limitation. May we come to, this is in the realm of the theater rather than the novel, another aspect of style which connects the world of prose writing and dramatic writing. It has, to me, always been interesting that in the American theater, very few so-called first-flight American dramatists are able to negotiate prose. The number of American distinguished dramatists who have been able to write lucid or helpful or even skillful prefaces is almost non-existent. Mr. Bierman is an outstanding, a radiant exception. Mr. Sherwood was an outstanding exception. Mr. Maxwell Anderson has, if anything, stated the tragic theory more eloquently in his prose prefaces than even in his own verse. I mention this because if you turn to the most distinguished American playwright, Eugene O'Neill, you will find that O'Neill has no prose style to speak of. He has never been able to write well in prose, and the interesting thing about O'Neill's dialogue is that much of it seems to the reader's eye undistinguished and drab. Yet O'Neill had the special style of a dramatist, of catching hold of rhythms of speech so that an actor could speak those speeches, granting them an intensity that better writing wouldn't have on paper.
O'Neill is wonderful for the actor, not always so good for the audience. But then, of course, there is such a tremendous craze for O'Neill at the moment, as in the novel there was for Dreiser, at one particular point, that, as the playwright Mark Connolly says, it's impossible to criticize O'Neill today. This is his Marian year.
Mr. O'Neill certainly has come again into the public zone.
And he has fought his way up, as you say, in spite of the style. We've be without style. And at the same time, if you have nothing but style, pure style and nothing else, then you're nowhere either. So that you really have to look for some happy marriage of the subject matter and the way you say it, don't you?
But then we go back to where we were in an earlier discussion. We go back to your friend, Mr. Matthew Arnold. We go back to the man in the moment. And there are styles that are absolutely correct from the moment of their first release, but they develop a kind of tragic sclerosis earlier than other styles. Why, we don't know. It isn't always merely simplistic. That isn't true. But there are public needs which fit into what are the releases of authors, or what the public gives the author, and that's when the style and the public meet. There has to be that. I believe that conjunction has always existed and always will.
Yes, of course, but this might also relate to character. Seems to me that another element of literature, subject to changing taste constantly, is the whole nature of character. For example, it used to be enough to put a man in a white hat on a white horse, taking only the precaution to make sure that he was clean-shaven and that everybody knew that he was virtuous and that he was the hero. But today, this hero is usually in black, and he wears a mustache, he beats his girlfriend, and goes to his analyst once a week. Of course, this is a very loose generalization, but at any rate, Mr. Brown, I should like during our next discussion to get into a consideration of character, how the writer goes about developing character, what clues he gives, and to what extent the artist's own character is revealed in his work.